Hello everyone. This is part 1 of the chapters 11, 12, and 13, which will be Sculpture, Crafts, and Architecture. Sculpture begins on page 240 in your text. Sculpture confronts us with a new concept for us in art. It confronts us with the concept of depth in art. So far we've just looked at flat two-dimensional things pretty much. This looks at different when viewed from different angles and different distances. It has one of the longest histories as an art medium, especially when you consider what might be referred to as sculpture. Ancient tools, shelter, the wheel, etc. There are 4 different methods of sculpture, and I want you to note that this is, of course, highlighted in red, so these are some of the things that you need to know for the exam. So the 4 methods of sculpture are modeling, casting, carving, and assembling. Modeling is when the artist begins with a simple framework or a core or even nothing at all and adds materials to it until the sculpture has taken the desired form. It is the most direct of all the sculpture methods. In other words, you've probably done this. If you've played with clay as a kid or Play-Doh as a kid, you've done the modeling. The most common material for this is, of course, clay. And fired clay is sometimes called the Italian name terracotta. So I'm sure you probably heard of that if your mom or your grandma has plants out in the yard in the summertime. Those are in those orange terracotta pots. We'll talk a little bit more about that more specifically when we get to pottery. So on page 243, figure 11.4 in your text, you will find an example of a modeled piece of pottery. Now here what we're seeing is the artist Jason Haidt and some of his modeled work. Now I want you to note that he is working on what is called an armature. So that's what this basic kind of stand device looks like. If you notice in the sculpture, the hands have wire fingers coming out. Okay, that's what part of that armature is. It's something for the clay to wrap around, so a core. So for him, he's got wire as part of that core, and then the bust of the female figure is something that he's already done before, so he's just precast it and he uses it again. The material that he's using is not regular straight up clay, it's a polymer clay. Now we see polymer clay done more in movies and people doing sculpting for what is called maquettes. So a character design, let's say like Star Wars and you want to say Darth Vader, the character would have been drawn out of it initially. There's the idea, and then the next step would be let's put it in a 3-dimensional form so I know what this thing looks like from all angles. Now that Jason Haidt shows us some of the process here. Here again, here's some of the drawing, the sketching, what his idea is, and then here you see next to it on the right, you see it's starting to flesh out in the actual clay, and he's even started to, on the facial figure there, put in some digital over the top of a photograph of the clay. And again, here's some more examples of it getting a little bit more detailed in the clay work, but then also what are some of his options he could do and going in on the computer over the top. Now, a lot of his stuff will start like this. You see the photographs behind the little aluminum foil figure here. And those photographs are, of course, of an obese person and then the Pope. I'm sorry if you're Catholic, this might offend, but here we see, again, an armature made out of wire, so you can see where the hands are supposed to be. We see some copper loops. And in this, he's actually, because of it being an obese person, he's taking the aluminum foil and he's kind of fleshing out, bulking up that sculpture, because you don't want your clay to be too thick. Traditional clay would crack and kind of fall apart. And polymer clay, the thicker it is, the longer it takes to bake. But in some of these places, it's not going to be very thick. So he wants some consistency of how thick the outside of this clay would be. So that's why he's fleshing it out in aluminum foil. Now, normally we would have that shoe assignment. We're not going to have the shoe assignment this particular semester, so but normally we would be here with this, we would be making a sculpture out of polymer clay ourselves. So let's see his next step. So here's his next step where he's actually on the left added some of the polymer clay over the top, trying to kind of take away, he's added, now kind of taking away to get a little bit more of the texture. And then on the right, you see here he's getting it a little bit more in that process where on the bottom he's getting the shapes that he wants, but on the top you can see where he's starting to try and get some of the fleshy kind of texture. So here's what I mean about that fleshy texture. Now the link at the bottom is a YouTube video link that I will be sharing a link page for you to go and watch these videos. And this particular video will be of Jason Hite talking about his work, talking about the products that he uses to create his work, kind of the process, and then also some of his influences that he has had and some of the people he's ended up showing work with. And some of those names that he will talk about are people that we've talked about before. Frank Frazetta from last semester, or from the last chapter, and also H.R. Giger is one that if you are a sci-fi person, you probably heard of H.R. Giger. He came up with a design for the aliens that you see in the Aliens movies. Now, modeling and another one of those sculpture methods, assembling, are considered to be additive process. So this is just like what it sounds like. We're adding material to. Now, this is a pretty good example of a modeled sculpture. This little baby. I usually in class setting, I would be asking you, what do you think this baby is made out of? And we just looked at something that was polymer clay, which would be a normal answer. But this little guy is actually made out of marzipan. So if I have anybody who knows anything about the culinary arts, marzipan is actually an icing that chefs sculpt with. It's kind of gross when you think about he's edible. And this is another sculpture just showing you different mediums that you can use in adding things to. So this is an additive process here of colored pencils to make a sculpture. Here are the actual wood chips. So if you had somebody who would carve, the wood chips are usually what we see falling on the ground. Here's an artist who's actually taking and adding those together and making sculptures out of the wood chips. Here's one that's a little bit different, you might not have ever seen before, but this is actually putting together actual objects that already exist to create and make something else. So here we see a couple of horses running through a wall. These horses are made out of found objects. So if you look, the black horse on the head has a spatula coming down and a trowel, a garden trowel for an ear. The white horse, you can see that definite spoon coming out for that ear. So it's pretty fun that artists can look at other objects and then think, oh, I'm going to put that together and make this totally new thing. And again, here's one that shows just a little bit closer where you see all these, kitchen utensils being used for creation of the betta fish sculpture. Now, casting is another method. In this method, the sculptor never touches the final piece. So what does that mean? It means that what the artist will do is they will actually sculpt the sculpture, and then what they'll do is they'll hand it off to someone else for them to make a shell around it, and then that shell is separated. Their sculpture is taken out of the middle, the two pieces of the shell are put back together, and then they can actually pour and put something in that hollow space to make up a new sculpture, and they can make multiple ones. So the most common material for casting is metal and bronze. You can also use plastic and clay, but I know myself, I'm going to think chocolate. Okay, the simplest type of casting is solid casting as opposed to hollow casting. Now, why do I bring that up? Because when we talked about sculpture before, we talked about the beer cans, and that beer can that was worth $1 million, it was a cast bronze. And one of the things that I had said to you is that you probably need to be asking yourself questions, especially when you see a price tag like that. Is it a solid casting or is it a hollow casting? If it's solid, they just pour that material in there and let it set. It's good and heavy and solid. You might think that that plays into the cost. But the hollow, if you think about, like I said, chocolate bunnies, a hollow bunny, chocolate bunny versus a solid chocolate bunny, the hollow is more expensive. Why? Because it's more work. They're putting that material in, then they're rolling it around so it gets in all the little nooks and crannies, and then pouring out the excess. And they might have to do this in a few layers to actually build up the walls so they're not so thin and flimsy. Okay, you can find on page 244, figure 11.5 in your text, a good example of a casted sculpture. Now, generally when we think of some of these castings, we know that, of course, metal is usually what is cast, but metal is also what is cast into what is called a lost wax method. I want you to take a look at the process of the lost wax method on page 245, figure 11.6 in your text. Now, the most common lost wax sculptures are the equestrian statues that we usually see in parks and things like that. There's also another video link there that on that sheet of the video links I would like for you to go to. This is a lost wax method, and it shows you the process of a sculpture being done in this particular method. And it's actually done by Stan Winston's school. If you know the name Stan Winston is synonymous with special effects in movies. So Jurassic Park and the dinosaurs, who's making those? Stan Winston. So it's pretty interesting video. It can be lengthy, but it shows you all that process and where some of the cost comes into making some of these things. Now, carving is another one of those methods. Now the sculptor will begin with a block of material, and then they will cut, chip, and gouge away until the desired sculpture is achieved. So this is that subtractive method where we've got some material and we're going to take away. Now, the most common materials for this are wood and stone. Now, on page 248, figure 11.9 and 11.10, you will see two carved sculptures, one in wood and one in stone. This is actually an example of a carved sculpture in wood, but was actually gone back over and painted. So something that would be kind of traditional and some of the things that you would see as far as sculptures hanging in churches and cathedrals. Now, Michelangelo is considered to have been the greatest genius of stone carving in the history of art. Page 372, figure 16.8, you will see this particular sculpture, which is his most famous, and this is the David. Now, this is actually a interesting sculpture that has been carved, and this is done by a Chinese sculptor who traditionally worked in marble, did fine marble-looking bust, sculptures, and he has changed it to this accordion layering of paper. And when this sculpture is put back together, it looks like that marble bust, but it actually stretches and moves, which is done a lot for things like, let's say, expansion of furniture, a chair that looks like a chair, but then you can take it and stretch it out into a couch. Very interesting. Take a look at that video link, and I warn you, there's subtitles because they are speaking in Chinese. Now, assembling. Assembling is a process by which pieces and segments or objects are brought together to form a sculpture. Page 112, figure 452, you'll see another example somewhat similar to what you see on your screen there as an Alexander Calder sculpture. So that's going to conclude part 1 of this section.